All right, let's dive into something really interesting today.
Right.
The U.S. Constitution, but, not just the typical stuff you hear.
Right.
We're going deeper, looking at it from a unique perspective.
Okay.
Dallin H. Oaks, he's a leader in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, gave a talk arguing that the Constitution is divinely inspired.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's what we're going to be unpacking.
Okay.
What does that even mean? What are the implications?
Yeah.
And, what's really fascinating is that Oaks brings this dual perspective to the table.
Right.
He's not just a religious leader.
Yeah.
He also has a background as a lawyer and a
Mhm.
judge, like decades of experience in the legal field.
It's that combination that makes his perspective so unique. He's bridging these two worlds, law and theology.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking about something Oaks pointed out. The U.S. Constitution is the oldest written constitution still in use in the world today.
It's true.
And it's been a model for so many other countries.
Mhm.
There's got to be something special about that. Like, what's the secret sauce?
Well, Oakes seems to suggest that this longevity and global influence is actually evidence of its divine origin.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
Divine origin.
Mm-hmm.
So he's saying that God had a direct hand in the creation of the Constitution.
That's his argument. He specifically says that God established the Constitution.
Yeah, established it. Okay, so that's a pretty bold statement.
It is.
But if we take that at face value, how do we explain some of the, shall we say, less than perfect parts of early American history?
What do you mean?
Well, I'm thinking about things like slavery, the treatment of Native Americans.
Ah, right.
How do you reconcile those things with the idea of a divinely inspired document?
That's a great question, and it's something that Oakes addresses head-on.
Okay.
He draws a distinction between the divinely inspired principles of the Constitution
Okay.
and the way those principles were actually implemented.
Oh, I see.
He acknowledges that the implementation was flawed from the start.
So it's like the foundation is solid, but the building itself needed some serious renovations.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, that makes sense. So then what are these divinely inspired principles? What's the foundation that Oakes is talking about?
Well, he identifies 5 core principles:
5.
popular sovereignty, federalism, separation of powers, the Bill of Rights, and the rule of law.
Okay, that's quite a list.
Mhm.
Let's unpack those one by one. Starting with popular sovereignty. What exactly does that mean?
Popular sovereignty is the idea that the power ultimately resides in the people.
Power to the people.
Exactly. It's the people who have the authority to govern themselves through elected representatives. It's a rejection of monarchy or any system where power is inherited or imposed from above.
A pretty revolutionary concept, especially when you consider the historical context.
Right. Think about it. Back then, most countries were ruled by kings and queens who claimed their authority came from God.
Divine right of kings.
Exactly. The U.S. Constitution completely flipped that script.
So it's not just a concept in a textbook. It's something that had real-world implications, a shift in how we think about power and authority. But has popular sovereignty always been upheld in practice? I mean, we've had our share of struggles and setbacks, right?
Absolutely. Think about the women's suffrage movement. For a huge part of U.S. history, women couldn't vote, which directly contradicts the principle of popular sovereignty.
You're right. It took decades of activism, protests, and even civil disobedience to finally win that right.
And even today, there are debates about voter ID laws, gerrymandering, and other issues that raise questions about access to the ballot box and the fairness of our elections.
Okay, so it's not just a historical concept. It's something we're still grappling with today. Popular sovereignty is an ongoing struggle, an ideal that we have to constantly strive for.
Precisely, and that's true for all of these principles. They're not static, they're dynamic, they're constantly being tested and reinterpreted in light of new challenges and societal changes.
That's a great point. So let's move on to the next principle on Oakes' list. Federalism. What's that all about?
Federalism is about balancing the power between the national government and the individual states.
Okay, so it's like a power-sharing arrangement.
Exactly. The Constitution divides powers and responsibilities between the federal government and the state governments.
So, like, education is typically handled at the state level,
Right, and national defense is a federal responsibility.
but it's not always so clear-cut. Right?
You're right, there are a lot of gray areas.
Think about the debates we have today about healthcare or environmental regulations. Where should that power reside?
Exactly.
It's a constant source of tension.
Federalism is this ongoing negotiation, this back and forth between the different levels of government. It's never truly settled.
Okay, so it's another one of those dynamic principles, constantly evolving as new challenges arise. So after popular sovereignty and federalism, we have, what was it?
Separation of powers?
Right, separation of powers. That sounds pretty important. What's that all about?
This is where the framers really showed their genius. They divided governmental power among three distinct branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial.
Okay.
The idea is to prevent any one person or group from having too much power.
Right.
It's like that old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
So how does that actually work in practice? I mean, how do these three branches keep each other in check?
Well, let's take the process of passing a law.
Okay.
Congress, which is the legislative branch, can write and pass a bill.
Right.
But the president, who's the head of the executive branch, has the power to veto that bill.
So the president can just say no.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That veto power is a check on the legislature. But Congress also has a check on the president.
How's that?
They can override a presidential veto, but it requires a supermajority vote.
So it's not easy to do.
Right. It's a high bar.
Yeah.
And then you have the judicial branch, the courts, who have the power to review laws passed by Congress
Okay.
and actions taken by the president.
And they can decide if those laws or actions are constitutional or not.
Precisely.
It's like a three-way tug of war, with each branch having its own set of powers to balance the others. So give me a real-world example of how this plays out.
Well, back in 1937, President Franklin D. Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court.
Pack the court. What does that even mean?
He wanted to appoint a bunch of new justices who would support his New Deal programs because the existing court kept striking them down as unconstitutional.
So he was trying to stack the deck in his favor.
Exactly. But Congress and the public pushed back hard against his plan.
They saw it as a power grab.
Exactly. And ultimately, Roosevelt's plan failed. It's a classic example of how the separation of powers can prevent one branch from becoming too dominant.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so we've covered popular sovereignty, federalism, and separation of powers. What's next? What's the fourth principle that Oakes highlights?
The Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights, right. Those are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution.
Exactly.
And they guarantee individual rights and freedoms.
Things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures.
Right, the big ones. The Bill of Rights is basically a shield against government overreach.
Yeah.
It's there to protect us from tyranny.
Exactly. It establishes limits on what the government can do, even if it has the support of a majority. It recognizes that individual rights are fundamental and cannot be trampled on, even in the name of the common good.
And those debates continue today, right? Like the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is a constant source of controversy.
Absolutely. And that's what makes the Bill of Rights so dynamic and relevant. It's not a static set of rules.
Yeah.
It's a framework for ongoing discussion and debate about the balance between individual liberty and the needs of society.
So it's a living document in a sense.
In a way, yes. It's constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted in light of new circumstances and challenges.
Okay, so that's 4 down, 1 to go. What's the final principle on Oakes's list?
The rule of law.
The rule of law. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It means that everyone is subject to the law. No one is above it, not even the president or members of Congress.
So it's about equality before the law.
Exactly. Everyone is treated the same under the law, regardless of their wealth, their status, or their political connections.
It's about creating a level playing field.
Precisely. And that's essential for a just and fair society.
Okay, so those are the 5 principles that Oakes argues are the divinely inspired foundation of the U.S. Constitution: popular sovereignty, federalism, separation of powers, the Bill of Rights, and the rule of law. But if these principles are so important, why haven't they always been upheld perfectly throughout history? I mean, we've had our share of injustices and violations, right?
That's a great question. And it's one that Oakes acknowledges head on. He says that the imperfection comes from us, not the principles themselves. Humans are fallible. We make mistakes. We interpret things differently.
Sure.
And sometimes we prioritize our own self-interest over the common good.
So it's like having a perfect blueprint, but the builders aren't always perfect.
That's a great analogy.
And that's where I think the real challenge lies. It's not enough to just admire the Constitution and its principles.
No.
We have to actively work to make sure those principles are reflected in our laws, our institutions, and our daily lives.
And that's exactly what Oakes calls us to do. It's a call to action.
Welcome back. It's really interesting to think about the Constitution as something we need to actively work on.
Yeah, not just something we admire from afar.
Right. So let's get to that call to action.
Mm.
What does Oaks say we can actually do? Like, give me a to-do list. What are our responsibilities as citizens to uphold these principles?
Well, he starts with something that might surprise you.
Okay.
Prayer.
Prayer.
He encourages us to pray for our leaders, our nation,
Wow.
to seek divine guidance in how we live our civic lives.
Well, prayer. That's not what I was expecting.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems so personal for something as big and complex as government.
You're right. It's not the usual advice you hear in a civics class, but think about it from Oak's perspective. If you believe these principles are divinely inspired, well, it makes sense to seek guidance from that higher power.
I can see that connection.
Yeah. It's like he's saying our spiritual lives and our civic engagement, they're not separate things. They're intertwined.
Okay, so prayer is step one. What else is on the list?
Education. And he doesn't just mean memorizing amendments and dates and stuff.
Right.
He wants us to really understand these principles, to be able to articulate them.
Have thoughtful discussions about them.
Exactly. To be an informed citizen, not just someone who votes every few years.
So it's about more than just casting a ballot. It's about being engaged, participating in the process.
Right. And he believes that starts with a deep understanding of the Constitution and those core principles.
Okay, so we've got prayer and education. What about actual political action? Like, what does he say about getting involved in the political process?
He's all for it. He encourages us to support wise and good leaders. You know, people who demonstrate a commitment to the Constitution.
That sounds simple enough.
Yeah.
But honestly, in today's political climate, sometimes it feels like those leaders are few and far between.
I hear you.
It's tough.
It is. And that's why Oakes emphasizes the importance of being discerning, you know?
Yeah.
Really evaluating candidates, looking at their platforms, not just following party lines blindly.
It's about thinking for yourself, right?
Exactly.
Looking beyond the rhetoric.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out if a candidate's actions and policies actually align with those core principles.
Precisely. And it's not just about national elections either.
Oh, right.
Oakes says we need to be engaged at all levels of government, local, state, national.
So it's about taking ownership of our communities, right?
Hmm.
Recognizing that we all have a responsibility to shape the direction of our government.
And he takes it even a step further. He says we have a personal responsibility to decide which issues are most important to us
Oh, interesting.
and to act accordingly.
So it's like, figure out what you care about most and then do something about it.
Right. You know, we can't be experts on everything. Right.
But we can choose our battles. We can focus on the issues that resonate with our values and beliefs.
That makes sense. So it's about finding your own niche, finding your own way to make a difference.
Exactly. And that might mean volunteering for a cause, donating to an organization,
Yeah.
or just speaking out, raising awareness.
Okay, so there's no one right way to do it. It's about finding your own path to civic engagement.
Right. And I think this next point is really important because there's often a tension between this personal responsibility and the political landscape.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Oakes says that sometimes upholding the Constitution might mean supporting a candidate or a party whose other positions you disagree with.
Ooh, that's a tough one. It's like, do you hold your nose and vote for someone because they align with you on one key issue?
Yeah.
Or do you stick to your principles even if it means losing on that one issue? It's a real dilemma. And honestly, Oakes doesn't give us any easy answers. He basically says we have to prioritize those core constitutional principles, but also weigh them against our own conscience.
So it's about finding that balance,
Yeah.
figuring out where your lines are.
And Oakes also reminds us that we're all navigating this together.
Right.
We're bound to have different perspectives.
Yeah.
Different ideas about how to best uphold these principles. And he really emphasizes the importance of not judging others' choices.
It's about respecting different viewpoints.
Yeah.
Recognizing that we can disagree on specifics while still sharing a commitment to those fundamental principles.
Exactly. And that's a message that feels especially important these days when things are so polarized.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, Oakes is offering a different path, one that's rooted in respect and dialogue, not just division.
I like that. So one thing that really stood out to me in Oakes's talk is how he brings faith into the conversation. It seems like he's suggesting that belief in the divine inspiration of the Constitution can actually motivate us to be more active and engaged citizens.
It's an interesting idea. I think for Oakes, This belief isn't just a theological concept. It has real-world implications for how we live our lives,
Hmm.
how we participate in our communities and in the political process. It's about connecting our civic duties to our spiritual
So
values.
it's not about trying to impose your religious beliefs on others.
No, not at all.
It's about drawing inspiration from your own faith to guide your actions in the public sphere.
Right. And it brings up this often debated question.
What's that?
Is the U.S. Constitution actually divinely inspired?
Ooh, big question. And honestly, we've been dancing around it this whole time. What do you think? Do you buy Oakes' argument?
Well, there's no way to prove it definitively one way or the other.
Sure.
But what I find compelling about Oakes's approach is that it encourages us to see the profound significance of this document.
So, whether or not we agree with the whole divine inspiration idea, we can still appreciate the power and influence of the Constitution.
Right. And it gets you thinking, right?
Yeah.
If the U.S. Constitution has served as this model for so many other nations, what does that mean for the future of global democracy?
Whoa, that's a big question.
It is.
We could do a whole other deep dive on that one. But before we go there, we've got one more loose end to tie up.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the responsibility of citizens.
Right.
But what about the government? What's its role in all of this? How do we make sure the government itself upholds the Constitution?
That's a great question, and that's exactly what we're going to explore in part 3 of this deep dive.
Can't wait. See you there. All right, so we're back for the final part of this deep dive into the U.S. Constitution. We've covered a lot of ground already.
We have.
Divine inspiration, citizen responsibility.
Mhm.
And now we're going to zoom in on the government itself. What's its role in all of this? How do we ensure that the government, with all its power, actually stays true to the Constitution?
Well, the framers of the Constitution were really smart about this. They knew that power can be dangerous, and they didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past where governments turned tyrannical.
Right, so they built in some safeguards.
They did.
Like what kind of safeguards are we talking about?
The biggest one is the system of checks and balances.
Right, that's what we talked about earlier. The separation of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches.
Exactly. And each branch has specific powers that can limit the actions of the other branches.
Okay, so it's like a three-way tug of war.
Kind of.
Yeah.
It's designed to prevent any one branch from having too much power,
Right.
dominating the others.
Okay, so remind me how that works in practice. Can you give me a real-world example?
Sure. Take the power of the purse.
The power of the purse.
Yeah, it means that Congress, the legislative branch, has control over the money.
Oh, right. They decide how the money is spent.
Exactly. They get to decide how federal funds are allocated. And that gives them a lot of power over the executive branch, which is the one that actually implements those programs and policies.
So if the president wants to do something big, start some new initiative, they need Congress to sign off on it to provide the money.
Precisely. And that can lead to some pretty interesting negotiations.
Well, I bet.
Congress can use their power over the purse to influence the president's agenda, to push for certain priorities.
Or to block things they disagree with.
Exactly. It's this constant back and forth, a balancing act.
I'd see. So that's how Congress keeps the president in check. What about the courts? How do they fit into all this?
Well, the courts have the power of judicial review.
Judicial review. What's that?
It means they can examine laws passed by Congress and actions taken by the president to determine if they're constitutional or not.
So they get to decide if something is legal or not.
Yeah, in terms of whether it aligns with the Constitution. So if Congress passes a law that violates someone's constitutional rights, for example, the courts can step in and declare the law invalid.
Wow. That's a big power.
It is, and that's why appointments to the Supreme Court are such a big deal.
Right, because they have the final say.
Yeah, they ultimately interpret the Constitution and how it should be applied.
Okay, I get it. But even with all these checks and balances, history shows us that things can still go wrong.
They can.
People in power can abuse their authority, try to get around the rules.
That's true. It happens. It's this constant tension in a democracy, this balancing act between government power and individual liberty.
And that brings us back to the idea of citizen responsibility, right? Like, we can't just assume the system will work perfectly on its own.
You're right. We have to be vigilant to hold our leaders accountable.
That's what Oakes talks about, isn't it? That personal responsibility to speak up when we see those principles being undermined.
Exactly. Whether it's through corruption or abuse of power or just plain disregard for the Constitution.
So how do we do that? How do we effectively hold the government accountable? What can everyday people actually do?
Well, it starts with being informed, right?
Like knowing our rights.
Yeah, understanding how the government works, knowing what's at stake.
It's about paying attention.
Right,
Right.
paying attention to what our elected officials are doing, how they're voting.
What policies they're supporting.
And it's not enough to just skim the headlines, you know? We have to dig deeper, form our own informed opinions.
Okay, and then what? Once we're informed, what can we do?
Well, we can make our voices heard,
How?
write to our elected officials, attend town hall meetings.
Participate in protests.
Right. And engage in those hard conversations, you know?
Yeah.
Have those dialogues with people who see things differently.
It's about using our voices, right? Our votes,
Mm-hmm.
our collective power to try and shape the direction of our government.
And don't forget the press.
Right, the media.
A free and independent press is so important for holding those in power accountable.
Yeah, they can investigate wrongdoing, expose corruption.
Shine a light on things that people might try to hide.
It's about keeping those in power transparent, letting them know they're being watched.
And that there are consequences if they step out of line.
And there are mechanisms within the government itself to address that stuff, right? Like, what about impeachment?
Right. Impeachment is a process that allows Congress to remove a president, vice president, or other federal officials from office.
If they've committed treason, bribery, or, other serious crimes.
Exactly. And then there are things like the Inspector General system.
Right, where each agency has its own internal watchdog.
Exactly. So there are tools in place to hold people accountable.
But it all comes back to citizens being engaged, right?
Mm-hmm.
Demanding transparency.
You got it. It's a two-way street.
The government is accountable to the people, but the people have to hold them to it.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process, this constant interplay between the government and the governed.
It's like that old saying, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.
I love that saying.
We can't just assume our rights and freedoms will be protected automatically. We have to actively participate, demand transparency, and make sure that our government stays true to those core principles enshrined in the Constitution.
You know, it's pretty amazing when you think about it, that the Constitution, written so long ago, is still so relevant today.
It's a testament to the power of those ideas, those aspirations for freedom, justice, self-governance.
And it's a reminder that those aspirations, they're not a given. They have to be fought for,
Protected.
upheld.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
I think so, too.
We've explored a lot, We started with this intriguing idea of divine inspiration. Then we looked at the responsibilities of both citizens and the government.
It's been quite a journey.
And hopefully, we've left our listeners with a new appreciation for this incredible document that has shaped our nation and inspired others around the world.
I hope so. The Constitution really belongs to all of us. And it's up to us to keep it alive,
Yeah.
to make sure those principles continue to guide us as we face the challenges of the future.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the U.S. Constitution. Keep those conversations going, keep thinking critically, and most importantly, stay engaged.